The black silk veil fell like a mourning shroud across Catherine Ashford's face, its weight a constant reminder of the flames that had stolen not just her beauty, but her place in the world. She pressed herself against the back wall of the Silverbrook Opera House, watching through the heavy fabric as elegant ladies in their finest gowns swept past, their laughter bright as crystal against the velvet darkness of the theatre lobby. 3 years had passed since the fire, and still Catherine felt like a ghost haunting the edges of a life she could no longer claim. The Opera House had once been her second home, where she had stood center stage bathed in gaslight, her soprano voice soaring above the orchestra to reach the furthest balcony seats. Now she could barely manage to slip unnoticed into the back row for the occasional performance, her scarred hands trembling as she pulled the veil closer around her face. The doctors had saved her life, but they could not save what mattered most to a woman in 1887, her appearance, her prospects, her very identity in a world that measured female worth by the smoothness of skin and the perfection of features. The accident had been swift and merciless. A gas lamp knocked over during rehearsal, stage curtains catching fire faster than anyone could react, and Catherine trapped beneath a burning beam for precious minutes before the stagehands could free her. The flames had claimed the left side of her face and neck, leaving behind a landscape of scars that no amount of powder or prayer could disguise. The voice that had once drawn crowds from 3 counties away now seemed worthless without the face to match it. Tonight's performance was Verdi's La Traviata, an opera Catherine had sung dozens of times in better days. She closed her eyes behind the veil and let Violetta's aria wash over her, her lips moving silently with words she knew by heart. The current soprano was technically proficient, but lacked the emotional depth that had made Catherine's performances legendary. She could have sung it better, even now, even scarred and veiled and hidden in the shadows. "Magnificent, isn't it?" a voice said softly beside her. "Though I must say the phrasing in the second verse could use more vulnerability." Catherine turned, startled that anyone had noticed her presence, let alone approached her. The man settling into the seat beside her was perhaps 40 years old, well-dressed but not ostentatious, with dark hair touched by silver at the temples. His eyes, she noticed, stared straight ahead toward the stage, without seeming to focus on anything in particular. "You're blind," she said before she could stop herself, the words muffled by the veil but audible in the space between arias. "Since birth," he replied with a slight smile. "And you're the woman with the veil who sits in the back row at every performance. I hear you breathing differently during the emotional passages, like someone who understands the music from the inside." Catherine felt heat rise in her damaged cheeks. She had thought herself invisible in her mourning clothes and careful positioning, but apparently sound carried secrets that sight could not conceal. "I don't know what you mean," she whispered, though even as she said it she realized the futility of lying to someone who navigated the world through truth gathered by ear. "Of course you do," he said gently. "I'm Daniel Morrison, by the way. I play piano at the Music Conservatory, and before you ask, yes, I can tell by your voice that you're a singer, or were a singer. The breath control, the way you unconsciously correct the soprano's pitch, it's all there in how you speak." Catherine's hands gripped the armrests of her seat. This stranger saw through her disguise as easily as if she wore no veil at all, reading the story of her loss in the very air around her. "I used to sing," she admitted finally. Before the fire," Daniel said matter-of-factly. "I heard about the accident at the Majestic Theatre. You're Catherine Ashford, aren't you? I attended several of your performances. Your Tosca was transcendent." Catherine felt tears gather behind the veil. No one had spoken her professional name aloud in 3 years. Her own family had taken to introducing her simply as "our daughter Catherine," with no mention of her former career, as if her identity as a singer had died in the flames along with her unmarked face. "That was a long time ago," she said, her voice barely audible above the orchestra. "Time doesn't diminish true talent," Daniel replied. "It only refines it, like wine aging in darkness until it reaches its perfect depth." The metaphor struck Catherine like a physical blow. Aging in darkness. Was that what she had been doing these past 3 years? Hiding behind veils and shadows, letting her gift wither from disuse while she mourned what the fire had taken. As the curtain fell for intermission, Daniel turned toward her with an expression of gentle determination. "Would you like to hear something extraordinary? There's a piano in the green salon upstairs. The acoustics are quite good, and it's usually empty during performances." Catherine shook her head instinctively. "I couldn't. People see what they expect to see," Daniel said, rising from his seat. A woman in mourning clothes accompanying a blind man to a private room for musical purposes would surprise no one. The question is whether you're ready to stop hiding from yourself. Catherine sat frozen as Daniel waited patiently beside her seat. Around them, the theatre crowd stretched and chattered, discussing the soprano's performance with the casual authority of people who had never stood on a stage themselves. She thought of the years she had spent in this place, the joy she had felt bringing music to life, the sense of purpose that had defined her very existence. I can't, she stammered. You can, Daniel said simply. The only question is whether you will. Something in his voice, a quiet certainty and absence of pity, gave Catherine the courage to stand. Together they made their way through the lobby, Catherine grateful for the veil that hid her burning cheeks as curious glances followed their progress. The green salon was indeed empty, containing only a few chairs arranged around a beautiful grand piano that gleamed in the soft gaslight. Daniel settled himself at the bench with the fluid grace of someone completely at home with the instrument. His fingers found the keys without hesitation, beginning a gentle melody that Catherine recognized as the opening to Caro mio ben, a classic aria perfect for warming the voice. Whenever you're ready, he said, his hands continuing their graceful dance across the keys. Catherine stood behind him, her throat tight with 3 years of accumulated fear and grief. The melody was so familiar, so beloved, that her body responded before her mind could interfere. She began to hum, barely audible, testing the waters of her neglected voice. Louder, Daniel encouraged, his playing growing stronger to support her tentative sound. Let it fill the room. Catherine's humming grew stronger, and then, almost without conscious decision, she began to sing the words. Her voice was rusty from disuse, uncertain at first, but as the familiar phrases flowed from her lips, she felt something unlock in her chest. The voice was still there, not unchanged perhaps, but present and powerful and uniquely hers. Daniel's accompaniment shifted to match her interpretation, following her rubato and breathing, creating a partnership between piano and voice that felt as natural as conversation. When the song ended, Catherine realized she was crying behind her veil, tears of loss and relief and something that might have been hope. Beautiful, Daniel said quietly. Absolutely beautiful. Your voice has depth now that it didn't have before. Pain has seasoned it like oak-aging whiskey. Catherine touched her veiled face with shaking fingers. But who would want to hear a voice that comes from behind a veil? Who would hire a singer they can't bear to look at? Daniel turned on the piano bench to face her, his sightless eyes somehow finding hers with uncanny accuracy. Catherine, do you know what I see when I listen to music? She shook her head, then remembered he couldn't see the gesture. No? I see colors that have no names, shapes that don't exist in the physical world, emotions made visible in ways that sighted people can't imagine. Music creates its own reality, its own beauty that transcends anything the eyes could ever show us. He paused, his expression earnest. When you sing, you paint pictures in sound. Your scars can't touch that. The fire couldn't burn that. It's yours forever, and no one can take it away unless you let them. Catherine felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of chains she hadn't even realized she was wearing. But practically speaking, Daniel interrupted, there are venues where the voice matters more than the face. Concert halls where the audience listens in darkness. Private salons where music lovers gather for the art, not the spectacle. Church choirs where the glory belongs to God, not the singer's appearance. He stood and moved toward her, stopping just close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence. More than that, there are teaching opportunities. The conservatory is always looking for instructors with professional experience. Students care about skill and knowledge, not beauty. Catherine had never considered teaching, had never imagined that her hard-won experience could be valuable to others. The idea felt both terrifying and strangely liberating. I don't know if I'm ready, she whispered. No one ever is, Daniel replied, but readiness is overrated. Courage, on the other hand, is priceless. Over the following weeks, Catherine found herself returning to the opera house for reasons beyond attending performances. Daniel had arranged for her to use the green salon piano during the day for practice, and slowly, carefully, she began to reclaim her voice. Each session was a small act of rebellion against the shame and fear that had governed her life since the fire. Daniel proved to be an intuitive accompanist and a gentle but exacting critic. He pushed her to explore the new depths her voice had acquired, to mine the pain of her experience for artistic gold, rather than simply enduring it as a burden. Under his guidance, Catherine began to understand that her voice had not been diminished by suffering, but transformed by it. "Sing it as if you're comforting someone who has lost everything," he instructed, during one particularly challenging passage, "not as if you're trying to prove you still can." The difference was subtle but profound. Instead of fighting to recapture her former sound, Catherine began to discover what her voice could become. The scars that marked her face seemed to have their equivalent in her singing. Not wounds to be hidden, but evidence of survival, of battles fought and endured. Word of their sessions began to spread through Silverbrook's musical community in the way that news travels among people who share a passionate interest. Mrs. Vanderbilt, who hosted the city's most exclusive musical salons, approached Catherine after one of her practice sessions with an unexpected proposal. "Miss Ashford," she said, her voice carefully neutral, "I understand you've been working with Mr. Morrison on your return to singing." Catherine instinctively raised her hand to her veil, but Daniel's voice came from behind her, steady and supportive. "Mrs. Vanderbilt, how lovely to see you again. Yes, Catherine has been rediscovering her remarkable gift." "Indeed." Mrs. Vanderbilt studied Catherine with the calculating gaze of a woman accustomed to evaluating social risks and benefits. "I'm hosting a salon next Friday evening, a small gathering of music lovers for an intimate concert. Perhaps, would you consider performing? The lighting could be kept quite dim and the audience would be limited to my most understanding guests." Catherine felt her heart race with terror and longing in equal measure. The offer was both generous and insulting, a chance to sing again, but only in shadows, only for people prepared to overlook her disfigurement for the sake of her voice. "That's very kind," she began, preparing to decline, but Daniel's hand found her arm. "We'd be honored," he said firmly. "What did you have in mind for the program?" As Mrs. Vanderbilt outlined her vision for the evening, Catherine felt the familiar mixture of excitement and stage fright that had once been as natural to her as breathing. But underneath those familiar sensations was something new, a quiet determination that had nothing to do with beauty or social acceptance, and everything to do with the simple, irrefutable fact that she had something valuable to share. The salon evening arrived grey and rainy, which Catherine took as an omen that the lighting would indeed be dim enough to provide some measure of concealment. She had chosen her darkest dress and most concealing veil, but as she and Daniel arrived at the Vanderbilt mansion, she realized that her appearance mattered less than she had imagined. The guests were already seated in the music room when they entered, perhaps 20 people arranged in comfortable chairs around the piano. The gas lamps had been turned low, creating pools of golden light that left much of the room in gentle shadow. Catherine could see faces turned toward them with expressions of polite curiosity and well-bred anticipation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mrs. Vanderbilt announced as Daniel settled himself at the piano, "tonight we have the privilege of hearing Miss Catherine Ashford, accompanied by Mr. Daniel Morrison. I trust you will find the experience memorable." Catherine took her position beside the piano, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Through the veil, the audience seemed to shimmer like figures in a dream, present but somehow unreal. She felt Daniel's eyes on her, or rather, felt his attention, his steady presence that had become her anchor in this new world she was tentatively entering. The program they had chosen was carefully crafted to showcase not just Catherine's technical skill, but the emotional depth her voice had gained. They began with Schubert's Gretchen am Spinnrade, a song that told the story of a woman spinning and thinking of her lover, the music capturing both the mechanical rhythm of the wheel and the growing passion of her thoughts. As Catherine sang the opening phrases, she felt the familiar magic begin to happen, the moment when technique gave way to expression, when sound became something larger than the sum of its parts. Her voice filled the dim room with yearning and longing, and she sensed rather than saw the audience leaning forward, drawn into the emotional landscape she was creating. The song built to its climactic moment, where Gretchen remembers her lover's kiss and the spinning wheel momentarily stops in her distraction. Catherine's voice soared on the high notes, then dropped to an intimate whisper as the wheel resumed its steady rhythm. When the final notes died away, the silence in the room was profound, not empty but full of the resonance of genuine emotion shared. The applause when it came was warm and sustained, but more importantly, Catherine could hear in it the quality of response that every performer learns to recognize, the sound of an audience that has been genuinely moved rather than merely entertained. The rest of the program unfolded like a conversation between old friends. Daniel's accompaniment was so sensitive, so perfectly attuned to Catherine's interpretation that piano and voice seemed to breathe with one set of lungs. They performed Brahms, Schumann, and Verdi, each song chosen to explore different facets of Catherine's evolved artistry. When they reached the final song, Puccini's O mio babbino caro from Gianni Schicchi, Catherine felt something she hadn't experienced since before the fire, pure joy in the act of singing. The aria was light and playful, requiring not just vocal agility, but a sense of humor and charm that she hadn't been sure she still possessed. But as she sang Loretta's wheedling plea to her father, Catherine found herself smiling behind her veil, delighting in the music's wit and warmth. The applause that followed was enthusiastic and heartfelt, and Catherine realized that several people in the audience were wiping their eyes. Mrs. Vanderbilt rose from her seat, her usual composure replaced by something approaching genuine emotion. "Miss Ashford," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the room, "that was extraordinary, truly extraordinary. I haven't heard singing of that caliber since your performances at the Majestic Theatre." Catherine felt heat rise in her cheeks, but this time it was not entirely from embarrassment. For the first time in 3 years, someone had connected her present self with her past achievements, acknowledging continuity rather than loss. "Thank you," she managed, her voice barely audible. "I hope," Mrs. Vanderbilt continued, "that this will not be our last opportunity to hear you perform." As the evening wound down and guests approached to offer their congratulations, Catherine found herself in conversations she hadn't imagined possible. Dr. Harrison, who had attended many of her past performances, spoke knowledgeably about the new depths her voice had acquired. Miss Peterson, a young music teacher, asked shyly about the possibility of voice lessons. Most surprisingly, Father McKenna from St. Mary's Cathedral approached with an unexpected proposition. "Miss Ashford," he said in his gentle Irish brogue, "I've been looking for someone to direct our church choir and serve as soloist for special occasions. The position pays modestly, but it would provide steady income and the opportunity to share your gift regularly. Would you consider it?" Catherine stared at him through her veil, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "Father, you do realize? I realize that you have one of the finest voices in the territory and a depth of musical understanding that could inspire our congregation," he said firmly. "Everything else is secondary to that." As she and Daniel rode home through the rain-washed streets, Catherine felt as if she were waking from a long, troubled sleep. The evening had shown her possibilities she hadn't dared to imagine, not a return to her former life, but the creation of something entirely new. "How do you feel?" Daniel asked as their carriage turned onto her street. Catherine considered the question seriously. "Terrified," she said finally, "but also alive. For the first time in 3 years, I feel alive." "Terror and aliveness often go hand in hand," Daniel observed. "They're both signs that something important is happening." Over the following months, Catherine's new life began to take shape. She accepted Father McKenna's offer and found deep satisfaction in working with the church choir, helping young voices discover their potential while rediscovering her own joy in music making. Her weekly solos became local events, drawing people from neighboring parishes who came specifically to hear the veiled singer of St. Mary's. She also began taking private students, teaching from the small studio she set up in her family's home. Word of her expertise spread through the city's musical community, and soon she had a waiting list of aspiring singers eager to study with someone who understood both the technical and emotional demands of the art. Most importantly, her friendship with Daniel deepened into something neither of them had expected. Their musical partnership had created a bond that transcended the usual boundaries of professional collaboration. They began spending time together outside of rehearsals and performances, taking long walks where Daniel's blindness and Catherine's veil seemed equally irrelevant, talking about music and life and the strange paths that had brought them together. "Do you ever regret it?" Catherine asked one autumn evening as they sat in her family's garden, listening to the last songs of the migrating birds. "Not being able to see, missing all the visual beauty of the world?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his face turned toward the setting sun he could not see but could feel warming his skin. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but then I remember that I hear things others miss. I notice the quality of silence between musical phrases, the way someone's breathing changes when they're moved by beauty, the sound rain makes on different types of leaves. Blindness has taught me that there are many ways to perceive the world, and sight is only one of them." Catherine touched her veiled face unconsciously. I used to think my scars made me invisible, but they actually make me more visible, just in ways I didn't want to be seen. And now, Catherine smiled, though Daniel couldn't see it. Now I think visibility has more to do with what we choose to share than what people can see. When I sing, I'm more visible than I ever was on stage without scars. It was during one of their evening walks that Daniel surprised her with a confession that changed everything between them. "Catherine," he said as they paused beside the fountain in the city square, "I need to tell you something that I probably should have mentioned months ago." Catherine felt her stomach clench with anxiety. In her experience, conversations that began this way rarely led anywhere good. "What is it?" Daniel turned toward her, his expression serious in the lamplight. "I've been in love with you since the night we first made music together. Not with your voice, though it's extraordinary. Not with the idea of you, though that's compelling too. With you, all of you, exactly as you are." Catherine stared at him through her veil, speechless. In the 3 years since the fire, no man had looked at her with anything but pity or carefully concealed revulsion. The idea that someone could love her, not despite her scars, but as someone for whom her scars were simply part of who she was, seemed impossible. "Daniel," she whispered, "you can't see me. You don't know what I look like now." "I know exactly what you look like," he said gently. "I know the way you move when you're nervous, the sound of your breathing when you're thinking deeply, the feel of your hand when you guide me around obstacles. I know your voice in all its moods, your laugh when something genuinely amuses you, the way you go very still when music moves you. I know you, Catherine. All of you." Catherine felt tears gathering behind her veil. "But if you could see, if I could see, I might be distracted by surfaces instead of understanding depths," Daniel interrupted. "I might miss the things that actually matter because I was busy judging things that don't." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and found her hands with his. "I love the woman who was brave enough to step back onto a stage despite her fears. I love the teacher who helps others find their voices. I love the friend who listens to my stories and shares her own. I love you, Catherine, not the face you had before or the face you have now, but you." Catherine had spent 3 years believing that love was something that could only exist in the past tense for her, something she had known before the fire but could never experience again. The possibility that someone could love her present self, her scarred and veiled reality, was almost too overwhelming to accept. "I don't know how to be loved like this," she said finally. "I don't know how to believe it's real." "Then let me show you," Daniel said simply. "Every day, for as long as you'll let me." Their courtship was unlike anything Catherine had ever experienced or imagined. Daniel courted her with music and conversation, with shared silences and gentle touch, with the patient understanding of someone who knew that healing happened slowly and in its own time. He never asked her to remove her veil, never pressed for promises she wasn't ready to make, but his constant presence and unwavering affection gradually convinced her that love could indeed survive and even flourish in forms she had never anticipated. When he proposed 6 months later, it was during a rehearsal break between 2 songs that had become particularly meaningful to them. They had just finished Schumann's Widmung, a song about love that transforms and elevates everything it touches, when Daniel turned to her with the quiet intensity she had learned to associate with his most important moments. "Catherine," he said, "I would like to spend my life making music with you, in every sense of that phrase. Will you marry me?" Catherine looked at this man who had given her back her voice, her purpose, her faith in the possibility of being loved exactly as she was. Behind her veil she was smiling through tears. "Yes," she said, her voice carrying all the certainty and joy of a perfectly sung high note. "Yes, I will." Their wedding was held at St. Mary's Cathedral, with Catherine's church choir providing the music and Father McKenna officiating. Catherine wore a simple white dress and her customary veil, but for the first time in years, the veil felt like a choice rather than a necessity, a piece of herself that Daniel loved because it was part of who she had become, not something he tolerated despite wishing it were different. As they exchanged vows, Catherine realized that Daniel had given her something far more valuable than her voice back. He had given her the understanding that true love sees with the heart rather than the eyes, hears with the soul rather than the ears, and recognizes beauty in forms that have nothing to do with conventional appearance. The years that followed were filled with music and love and the quiet satisfaction of lives well lived. Catherine's reputation as a teacher grew, and her students went on to careers in opera houses and concert halls across the country. Daniel became one of the most sought-after accompanists in the region, known for his ability to support and enhance any singer's natural gifts. Together, they established a music conservatory that welcomed students regardless of their background or circumstances, creating a place where talent and dedication mattered more than social status or physical appearance. Catherine's experience of overcoming adversity made her particularly gifted at working with students who faced their own challenges, and many of her pupils credited her not just with improving their voices, but with changing their understanding of what was possible. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Catherine surprised Daniel with a gift that spoke to the heart of their relationship. She had commissioned a composer friend to set one of her favorite poems to music, verses about love that transcends sight, beauty that exists beyond appearance, and the way two souls can create harmony together, regardless of the discord the world might see. As she sang the piece for Daniel in their private sitting room, Catherine reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The fire that had seemed to end her life had actually begun it in ways she could never have imagined. Behind her veil she was smiling, not because she had overcome her scars, but because she had learned that scars, like songs, could tell stories of survival and transformation and hope. "What are you thinking about?" Daniel asked as the last notes faded away. Catherine reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers in the gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "I'm thinking," she said, "that sometimes the most beautiful music comes from broken instruments that have learned to sing in new ways." Daniel lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her palm. "And I'm thinking," he replied, "that the most beautiful voices are the ones that have learned to make art from their scars." They sat together in comfortable silence, two people who had found in each other the perfect harmony between acceptance and aspiration, between what was lost and what could still be gained. Outside their window, the evening air carried the sound of students practicing in the conservatory they had built together, young voices reaching for notes they had never attempted before, learning that beauty came not from perfection, but from the courage to keep singing despite the risks. Catherine touched her veil gently, no longer a symbol of shame, but a reminder of the journey that had brought her to this moment. Behind the black silk, she was whole, not because her scars had healed, but because she had learned that wholeness had nothing to do with unmarked skin, and everything to do with an unmarked spirit that refused to stop creating beauty in whatever form it could take. When Catherine died at the age of 72, her funeral filled St. Mary's Cathedral beyond capacity. Students, colleagues, and music lovers from across the country came to honor the woman who had shown them that true artistry transcended physical limitations. The service featured a program of her favorite pieces, performed by the choir she had directed for nearly 30 years. Daniel lived another 5 years, continuing to teach and perform until his own death at 78. His last public performance was at the conservatory's annual benefit concert, where he played Catherine's anniversary song, while the current students sang the words she had loved so much about beauty that exists beyond sight. Their legacy lived on in the conservatory that bore their names, in the hundreds of students they had taught, and in the quiet revolution they had started simply by insisting that talent and character mattered more than appearance. But perhaps their most important legacy was the story they had written together, a story that proved love could bloom in any soil, take root in any heart, and create beauty that no fire could ever burn away.